So it's my pleasure today to introduce Xin-Lin Go and also Olivia Reeves. Xin-Lin is the director of the Devices Application section of the TGA, and Olivia is the assistant director of the Devices Emerging Technology section. So Xin-Lin is more on the pre-market, approving it and authorizing devices, and Olivia is more on the post-market side of things. But by and large, when you submit your medical device to the TGA, these are the two people who are in charge of looking after your application. So that, I'll hand her over to Xin-Lin to start the presentation.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you also to the New South Wales Active MedTech community for having us here. Today it's our pleasure to be here. As Tim had mentioned, my section is responsible for the pre-market assessment of applications, ensuring that the product meets safety and performance requirements for inclusion in the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. And a quick overview of for today's webinar, I will touch on regulation basics, covering the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, what is a medical device, and also cover our risk-based approach to medical device classification. I'll then move into the regulatory life cycle of a medical device and the process of getting a device to market in Australia. I'll touch on evidence requirements for applications, the assessment process, and also cover resources that are available to support applicants. I'll then pass it on to Olivia, who will then be talking about software regulation.
And I'll just make a comment that we do actually have a more dedicated webinar on software in November. So Olivia will be coming back for a second appearance, and I'll tell you more about that at the end. But the main thing I want to emphasize is this is your chance to ask lots of questions. So if you're looking to engage with the TGA, please put your questions in the Q&A, and I will interrupt throughout the course of the presentation to ask those questions in real time as we're on a slide. So don't hesitate to ask.
Thank you, Tim. And Olivia will be covering what's in and what's out in terms of software, medical devices, exclusions versus exemptions. She'll touch on classification rules and essential principles, and lastly on cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, and advertising. And so the TGA, we own and maintain the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, also known as the ARTG. And this register contains all approved medicines, medical devices, biologicals, and other therapeutic goods such as disinfectants. And all therapeutic goods, unless exempt or excluded, must be entered in the ARTG before they can be supplied in, imported into, or exported from Australia. And what is a medical device? It's defined as any apparatus, software, implant, or article that's intended to be used for human beings for the purposes of diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, prediction, prognosis, treatment, or alleviation of disease, injury, or disability, or also for the investigation, replacement, or modification of the anatomy or of a physiological or pathological process or state, or also for the control or support of conception. And we have a formal definition in section 41BD of our Act. And whether a product is a medical device, that would depend on the intended purpose of the product as defined by the manufacturer, and also the claims that's being made for the product. And so an accessory to a medical device is also considered to be a medical device and regulated as such. And medical devices, they are included in the ARTG as a kind of medical device. And so a medical device is taken to be the same kind as another medical device if they have the same sponsor, manufacturer, classification, and GMDN code. So a sponsor is an Australian-based entity that's legally responsible for the importation, exportation, and or sale of the medical device in Australia. And the application to include the device in the ARTG must be made to the TGA by the sponsor. And the sponsor must ensure and be able to demonstrate that the device meets all applicable requirements for safety and performance. And GMDN, that stands for the Global Medical Device Nomenclature System Code. And that is an international nomenclature system used by regulatory bodies throughout the world to consistently describe medical devices. And additionally, for the higher risk devices, they need to have the same unique product identifier to be considered the same kind of medical device. And the TGA, we undertake a risk-based approach to medical device regulation and strive to balance the need to provide patients and the healthcare system with timely access to innovative new technologies with the appropriate level of scrutiny for product safety, performance, and effectiveness. And so medical devices are classified according to the potential risk posed to the patient by applying classification rules set out under our regulations. And so the risk classification is based on considerations such as the device's intended use, for instance, the location of use, whether it contacts the central circulatory system or whether it's outside of those systems, and whether the device is active or non-active, risk to patients and the likelihood of harm, and also the degree of invasiveness to the human body. It could be non-invasive or whether it's invasive by via body orifice, whether it's surgically invasive or whether it's an implantable device. And also duration of continuous use. So we define continuous use as either transient, short-term, or long-term. If it's less than an hour, that's transient. If it's less than 30 days, that's short-term. And over 30 days, that's long-term.
So Xin-Lin, we've got our first question from Andre, who's asking, where can I find specific definitions of regulatory terms of art? He's calling terms of art, I'm not familiar with that, but that the TGA references, i.e. precise definition of the term sponsor, manufacturer, critical supplier, etc.
Sure. So that will be in our Therapeutic Goods Act. So there is an interpretation section. We also have a dictionary section in our regulations as well. So these information can be obtained there. And medical devices, they are assigned into one of 5 main classifications, depending on the level of risk that they pose. So the higher the level of risk, the higher the classification. And so for the lower risk devices, such as bandages, we generally rely on the applicant's self-certification of compliance with regulatory requirements, whereas for higher risk devices, such as pacemakers, that involves a direct evaluation of the available evidence by our specialist areas. And I'll touch on some upcoming reclassification changes for active implantable medical devices. So from the 25th of November this year, all active implantable medical devices, they will be reclassified from class AIMD to class 3. And examples of that would include implantable cardiac pacemakers and cochlear implants. And so any application for a new AIMD on or after the 25th of November this year, they must be submitted as an application for a class 3 medical devices. And for existing class AIMD entries that are already in the ARTG, a transition period applies. So to continue to supply the AIMD devices, applicants must notify the TGA by the 25th of May next year, and they have a transition period to submit a class 3 application by the 1st of November 2024. And we are waiving application fees for the first year of the transition period. So if you file for your class 3 application between 25th of November this year and 24th of November next year, application fees are waived for that. And right at the bottom, we have a link for further information on this upcoming change. And here we have a very high-level overview of the therapeutic good development life cycle. So it often starts with the design of and funding for a clinical trial. And if required, applicants can notify or apply to the TGA for the use of an unapproved product for clinical trials. And with data and evidence demonstrating the safety and efficacy of the product, an application is then made to the TGA to include the product in the ARTG. And if that product is, if the application is successful, the medical device can then be imported into, supplied in, or exported from Australia. And there are then post-market obligations on the part of the sponsor. And so that would include ensuring that the device continues to meet all regulatory requirements, reporting adverse events to the TGA, and also ensuring that advertising for the device is compliant with the Therapeutic Goods Advertising Code. And lastly, there's also various subsidies available from the Department of Health to assist with making products more affordable to consumers. And in terms of the process, a sponsor will need to lodge an application with the TGA. The application will need to include evidence to show that the manufacturer of the medical device is appropriately certified to manufacture that type of device. And the manufacturer is also required to hold evidence that demonstrates that the device is safe, fit for purpose, and will perform as intended. And so under the Australian Medical Device Regulatory Framework, the manufacturer must apply appropriate conformity assessment procedures and must ensure that the device complies with the essential principles. So the conformity assessment procedures, these are really a set of requirements for the manufacturer's QMS, quality management system, and also product assessment, with more rigorous procedures in place for higher risk devices. And on the right, the essential principles, they are a set of rules that are set out in our regulation that must be complied with to ensure the safety, performance, and quality of a medical device. And as you can see, they cover things like long-term safety, protection against radiation, clinical evidence, etc. And here I have some examples.
So just, Xin-Lin, before you move on, just going back to that previous slide.
Sure.
The product, is that you say, could include device history, checklist, clinical evidence, all those, so forth. Does that sort of vary from product to product, or is there kind of an table of expected table of contents that you'd expect to see?
Yes, so in general, we will expect a clinical, for instance, for a class 3 device, so an AIMD or a class 3 device, we will be expecting to see their clinical evidence report, their risk management reports. So those are the standard, I guess, information that we do require as part of our assessment.
Is there somewhere on the TGA website you can go and sort of download a sort of an example or a pro forma table of contents, so it's clear, people are clear about what they need to provide to you?
We do have a web link and a guidance on the audit process, so a lot of the information will be covered under that guidance.
Yeah. Okay.
And if there's anything else that is outstanding, the sponsor will be receiving an information for a request for information by one of our delegates or assessors.
But clearly, a lot of companies trying to minimize the time frame would like to sort of, on their initial submission, try and get it perfectly right, so they don't have to go through the toing and froing.
Sure. Sure, definitely. And so here I have a table of examples of regulatory evidence that's required based on the classification. Note that this is a non-exhaustive list. So the classification of the device, that would dictate the minimum conformity assessment procedures that the manufacturer must apply to the design, development, and production of their medical device, with more rigorous procedures in place for higher risk devices. And I have highlighted in bold the additional requirements required at a higher classification. So for instance, for a class 1 sterile or the class 1 measuring device, an MDSAP certificate is what is required. So that is medical device single audit pathway certificate. And for a class 2A, for instance, it will be an MDSAP certificate. In addition to that, will require a product assessment component. And so that could, for instance, be accompanied by a US FDA 510K certification. And if you move up to a class 3 or AIMD device, that will be a US FDA pre-market approval certification. So that's greater, I guess, more rigorous procedures in place the higher up the classification.
So I've just got some questions here from Pierre, who says, fine to mention MDD, but what about MDR? And he also mentions that MDD certificates are not issued anymore.
Yes, so there is a transition happening with the MDD moving into the MDR, the EU MDR. And so we are accepting EU MDR certifications as well for that. So yes, he's right. there. So as mentioned, this isn't an exhaustive list, and for a full list, I've pasted the link at the bottom. It's the therapeutic goods medical devices information that must accompany applications for inclusion. And in there, there's a full summary of all the acceptable regulatory evidence by classification. And the Australian regulatory system is very similar to the European Union's, and as such, our system have been set up here to allow devices to be supplied in Australia on the basis of European Conformity Assessment certification. So as you can see from this pie chart, the vast majority of applications that we receive rely on EU certification. And in 2018, we introduced a broader range of overseas assessments and approvals to support applications. And so that includes certifications from regulatory counterparts such as Japan, Canada, and the USA. And the TGA, we also issue conformity assessment certifications for manufacturers seeking to do so. And in terms of the medical device inclusion process.
Can I just ask a question before we move on to that last slide? I'm really interested to see that majority come through Europe. I presume that's a historical thing. Are you seeing a shift at all towards the US, given the changes that have happened in Europe? Are you seeing more people taking the FDA pathway?
We have seen an uptake in the use of comparable overseas regulators. However, that percentage still remains, I guess, reasonably small at present. I mean, that may grow or change, but I think that it is simply another pathway available for sponsors and manufacturers. And yeah, I guess our role is really just to, I guess, enable more pathways for sponsors and manufacturers to do so.
Sure, and I've got a question from Anushi, who said, on the pathway for breakthrough approval, similar to the USA, when the device could be useful for an emergency, can you provide any advice on the pathway for that?
Yes, absolutely. I'll be touching on that on a later slide. So we have the priority application determination pathway. So I'll talk about that in a few slides.
And another question from Jeff Sizer. What is the requirement for the QMS for a Class 1 device for both design and development and for the registered medical device manufacturer? Is ISO 13485 compliant and or certified?
Yes, I'll go back to this slide here. For a Class 1 device, because it is generally regarded as of lower risk, so we rely on the manufacturer's self-declaration of compliance with essential principles. So with that, we do not require, I guess, an actual certification from a regulatory authority. We do expect the manufacturer to be compliant against essential principles and having applied conformity assessment procedures to the manufacturer of their device.
Okay, and Pierre just clarified, breakthrough is not so much for emergency as for an EUA.
An EUA.
Yes, I'm not sure what it means either.
Yeah, neither do I. We might need further clarification on that.
Yeah, okay, well, let's just move on. Emergency use authorization.
All right. Yes, we do have under our Act, under our legislation, the power to enable yes, emergency use situations for certain products. So there is a regulatory pathway.
Which I imagine would have happened with some of the COVID equipment and so forth.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I thought I'd just chime in. We had a bespoke emergency legislative instruments that we put in place for COVID, for example, for ventilators. So it works quite differently here than in the US, but we do have provisions where we can do those things.
Yeah.
Thank you, Olivia. So in terms of the medical device inclusion process, a sponsor will first submit evidence of conformity assessment, and this is usually a certification from a competent authority or body who has inspected and certified that the manufacturer's QMS meets all legislative requirements. The sponsor then submits an application for the inclusion and provides further details such as manufacturer details, GMD and code, the classification, and any other relevant documentation. And a preliminary assessment is then made on the application, and the delegate will have 20 business days to select an application for audit if there are concerns. However, do note that there are mandatory audits that apply to certain categories of medical devices. And so if the application meets all legislative requirements, the application is then included in the ARTG. And so for an application undergoing audit, we have two different levels of audit, and we will determine what level of audit assessment is appropriate for the application. And the documents that are requested will then depend on the level of audit that's required. So for example, a level 2 audit will apply to all class 3 devices that are subjected to a mandatory audit. And on this slide here, we have information on how to lodge an application. It really is a two-step process. So the first step is for the sponsor to submit their manufacturer's evidence, and this is the QMS certification associated with the medical device. And once the evidence is accepted, the sponsor can then proceed with the actual application for the medical device. And we have comprehensive guidance available on our website. And we also have a team that can assist with general inquiries, and they can be reached via email or phone. And I've listed that at the bottom of this slide, and that's also available at the end of the presentation too. And so here I'll touch on priority applicant determination. And so applicants, they can seek priority consideration for their conformity assessment or medical device applications if they meet the criteria. So if granted priority application determination, the application will be allocated a front of queue priority throughout the relevant assessment processes by the TGA. So it's really important to note that all three criteria must be met in order to qualify. And so the first is that the intended purpose of the new device, which must be for the monitoring, treatment, prevention, or diagnosis of a life-threatening or seriously debilitating condition. And secondly, there is no medical device with that intended purpose in the ARTG, or that there is substantial evidence demonstrating a significant improvement with the new device. And lastly, the device must have a major clinical advantage or will result in a major public health benefit. In terms of resourcing available, we also have pre-submission meetings. And so this is available for sponsors and manufacturers. They tend to be really useful for new or emerging technologies or combination products. And these meetings, they allow the applicant and the TGA to obtain a common understanding of the therapeutic good and also to clarify regulatory requirements.
So to book one of these, you would just I presume send an email to that email address you mentioned earlier, devices@health?
Yes, that's right. That's right. And there's also a form that is to be filled in, and that is available through the link at the bottom as well. And here are some useful links for assistance and further resources. And as mentioned earlier, we have a dedicated medical devices information unit, and they handle a lot of inquiries, and they're very happy to assist. There's also a phone line that they can be reached on. We have a comprehensive guidance on the medical device inclusion process, and links to pre-submission meetings, priority applicant determination, and lastly, a link on unapproved products. So how unapproved products could be assessed in Australia.
So what do you mean by an unapproved product?
So for instance, that could be used for clinical trials. It could be an individual importing an unapproved product for personal use. So that's what we call the personal importation scheme. And it could also be products that are utilized in a medical setting under the special access scheme. So with a doctor or surgeon's approval as a prescribed provider, they could have access to a product that isn't approved or isn't in the ARTG.
Sure.
So there are various pathways to access these products.
Pierre's just asking, why is it not possible to get advice during a pre-sub about the clinical studies that are required, which would be very helpful?
We are able to provide non-binding guidance or feedback, but what we do not do is to actually evaluate the data itself in a pre-submission meeting, mainly due to resourcing constraints, and that usually requires more than the time required for a pre-sub meeting, and that happens during the clinical evaluation phase.
Thank you.
No worries. If there are no further questions on this aspect, we'll move on to, I'll pass it on to Olivia to talk on the regulation of medical device software. Over to you, Olivia. Thank you.
Thanks, Xin-Lin. We'll switch and I'll share my screen so I can flick through my slides. While I'm doing that, see if I can multitask. Not really, as it turns out. I'm the project lead for the reforms to how software and program devices are regulated. So I'll just go through some of the changes that have been made for these types of devices and the regulatory requirements, that how they relate to software and program devices specifically.
Sure, just before you move on, I did have another question come in right at the end of Xin-Lin's presentation there. If we have so from Susan Evans, thank you. If we have a prototype and are soon to begin initial clinical trials of a class 3 device, when should we initiate contact with the TGA and by which mechanism?
Sure. So for clinical trials, that would be, I guess the contact would be with the clinical trials area to notify them or to apply to run the clinical trials. Yes.
Okay, if they didn't answer your question, Susan, just shoot another question through. Okay, let's move on, because I do know, unfortunately, both Xin-Lin and Olivia have another meeting at 1 o'clock, so we have to sort of, unfortunately, press through fairly quickly, but we'll move on.
So I'll go through this fairly quickly because Xin-Lin touched on it already. So this is a question we get a lot, is when is software a medical device? And the quick answer is if it meets the definition of a medical device. So if it's software, be it standalone, or if it works with another piece of hardware or something like that, if it's intended to be used for diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, those sorts of things, it will meet the definition of a medical device. So it doesn't matter how the technology is implemented. It can be an app on a phone, it can be a web-based resource that you access through a browser, it can be in specialized hardware, it could be server-based with no user interface at all. It doesn't matter what it looks like, essentially, is if it's intended to be used for one of those things in the dark blue box, it will be considered a medical device. So the intended purpose is really important. So we see this a lot more with software not being so straightforward. So with a lot of hardware products, it's kind of their form is, it means it's inherent what they're intended to be used for. So a implantable heart valve kind of, you know, it's intended to do what it was designed for. Whereas with a lot of software, it can be used for things, all sorts of things, but it's not necessarily what the product can do. It's what the claims that are being made about the product. So I've got a little example here that illustrates this. So if you have an infrared thermometer that you market for the purposes of measuring human body temperature, specifically for clinical purposes, that would be a medical device. However, you could have the exact same device that has the exact same functionality, but it's marketed to measure the temperature of cooked meat. So it makes no claims about human body temperature or anything like that. So that second device, even though it looks identical, that wouldn't be a medical device. So another concept that gets a little bit tricky in the land of software is the regulatory concept of a manufacturer, which Xin-Lin spoke about before. So it's not necessarily who makes the device. It's the we say it's who has their name on the label or the name under which the product is supplied. So with software, this could be a software developer, it could be a service provider, it could be a publisher. The idea is that whoever retains responsibility for the design and development of that software would be considered the manufacturer. So I've got a little example here about a service provider who wants to publish some software under their name, but they outsource completely the design and development of the software to a third party. So in this case, they maintain the responsibility for the design and development. So they come up with all the specifications and things like that, and they publish the software under their name. So in this case, it's the service provider that's the manufacturer, not that third party developer. So this is just a little slide to indicate that not all health software is a medical device. There's been a lot of confusion about this in industry. TGA only regulates software if it meets that definition of a medical device. So to further clarify what is regulated by TGA and what isn't, some recent reforms introduced a number of exclusions and an exemption to help clarify what is regulated and what isn't. So these terms are quite similar. They have legally distinct definitions. So what we mean by exclusion is something that is completely unregulated by the TGA. If it's excluded, TGA doesn't have anything to do with it. So there might be other regulations that apply to it, for example, privacy laws. Also the ACCC might have some jurisdiction over these products, but they won't be covered by the Therapeutic Goods legislation. What an exemption is, it's for a product that still remains a medical device, it's just exempt from particular requirements. So TGA retains quite a lot of oversight, but there's just no requirement for the product to be included on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. And so there's no pre-market evaluation by the TGA. So that's that process that Xin-Lin spoke about before. What is expected and required is that the product still needs to meet the relevant essential principles for safety and performance. Any adverse events still need to be reported to the TGA, and the product is still subject to recalls and hazard alerts in the event of a problem. And these products are also still subject to the Therapeutic Good Advertising Code. So I mentioned we introduced a number of exclusions. So there were 15 total that we have introduced. These can be loosely grouped into these categories. So the first being for consumer related products. So these are products intended for the prevention and management of conditions that are not serious. There's an exclusion relating to digital mental health tools that are completely based on established published clinical practice guidelines. There are some exclusions in place to clarify that certain enabling technology isn't regulated, such as communications platforms for telehealth and things like that. There are a number of exclusions that relate to the digitization of paper-based or other published rules or resources. And there's also a couple of exclusions to do with population-based analytical tools where that analysis is not applied to individual patient use cases. And laboratory information management systems are also excluded. So this is just a little example of one of the exclusions to highlight that they're all conditional. This is one of the more complicated ones, but essentially there are a set of questions you need to ask about your product and to see whether it actually meets the conditions of that exclusion. So if at any point you kind of say, oh, yes, it is intended to be used in clinical practice, or it is for a serious condition or something like that, then it won't be excluded under that particular provision. So we do have some detailed guidance on this in the works to be published pretty soon, hopefully.
I've just got a question from Pierre saying you mentioned that you have oversight, but he says, how can you monitor exempt products if they're not on the ARTG?
That is a great question, and I do have an answer for it on my next slide, but I can tell you right now.
Yeah.
I'll move on. I will get to it in the next slide. So the exemption, as I mentioned, these are for products that are still regulated by the TGA, but they're exempt from the requirement of going on the ARTG. Now, we'll just clarify that clinical decision support software is a very broad term that applies to many different things and different people use it differently. Not all clinical decision support software would meet the definition of a medical device to begin with, so they would remain unregulated. This particular exemption is in place for a subset of low-risk clinical decision support software that do meet the definition of a medical device, but where their use is restricted and they meet these 3 criteria. So these 3 criteria are essentially that the product can only be used for the purposes of providing a recommendation or supporting a recommendation to a health professional about prevention, treatment, curing, monitoring, etc. They're not intended to be used to directly process or analyze medical images or signals from another medical device. So what we mean by that is not that they can't use information from another medical device or a health record or anything like that, but they can't, the software can't be directly responsible for collecting that information. So think about a X-ray suite. So there's the X-ray equipment and there's a software component which may be what you use to actually control the equipment and record the image. And then it may include also clinical decision support software elements as well, where it might highlight areas of concern or things like that. So the idea is we wouldn't want to exempt that kind of software. So if that particular CDSS module was completely separate, then that may qualify for the exemption. So it's a little bit complicated. The other criteria is that the clinical decision support software can't be intended to replace clinical judgment. And what we mean by that is we don't necessarily mean, obviously, a human person can choose to ignore something presented to them by a piece of software. But what we actually mean by this is, how is that information presented? And is that clinician able to see what the basis for that recommendation is? So the expectation for an exempt product would be that the logic for the recommendation is easily accessible to the clinician. So either it's based on a reference source or the logic is clearly stepped out within the software. So if a system is providing information to a clinician that they wouldn't otherwise have access to, so they wouldn't be able to verify that information in any way, then the system would not be exempt. So this hopefully will answer your question. Although the products that are covered by this exemption are not required to be included on the ARTG, we have included a requirement that sponsors of these products notify the TGA. So by sponsor, we just mean people who are supplying these products into Australia. So it could be the developers or anything like that as well. So we have a notification form, and this is quite different to applying to put something on the TGA. The notification form is very basic. It just has some contact information and a brief description about the product. And the other key thing is it's a notification, so it doesn't get any kind of formal approval by the TGA. It's just a means for us to be able to track who is using this exemption. And if we feel that there are any issues, so if we think someone's using this exemption, but their product doesn't actually meet the criteria or something like that, this just enables us to have a bit more visibility of that sort of thing.
Does that notification provide enough information for you to make that judgment?
No, it generally wouldn't in the first instance, but we still retain the ability to require people to provide us information if we request it. So if you're providing an exempt medical device and we say, oh, please provide us evidence that your product complies with the essential principles, or please give us a justification of why you think your product is exempt, we are able to do that.
Just got a question from Nicholas McKay here. I think it's sort of relating to the working through that decision tree. He says, do you have any comments in relation to artificial intelligence, any rules or guidelines?
I do have a little slide just tacked on to the very end of my presentation, but I can just cover it now. The idea...
Let's cover it at the end because I know we're short on time.
Well, yeah, if people are interested in it, okay, well, I'm the next.
If you've got a, let's talk about it then, yeah.
Okay, I'll do it that way then. All right, so this is just a little summary of the process that you would go through to work out if your product is regulated by the TGA. So we have a flowchart, which is a kind of first place where you can have a look to see if your product needs to be registered or is regulated by the TGA. So the idea is this is a first up, and then you would consult the more detailed guidance or the legislation if you need to. So the other thing we did as part of the reforms was introduce a number of classification rules specifically to cover software and programmed medical devices, because some of those principles that Xin-Lin spoke about in terms of invasiveness and how long a product's going to be used for and things like that didn't really adequately cover some of the risks to do with software products in terms of the information they provide to users. So I'll just give a brief overview of classification rules and how they apply to software and programmed products. So a few key things to consider are those things that Xin-Lin mentioned, like, are there any physical interactions with the patient or user? So this would be for software that isn't necessarily standalone, but uses hardware. So if it does use hardware, is it invasive? Does it use energy outside the visible spectrum? Is it controlling a device that is infusing medicines into the patient, things like that? There are specific rules that apply to those sorts of products. The other things you can look at is if your product is more information-based, what is that information intended to be used for? Is it for diagnosis or screening? Is it for monitoring? Is it for informing or delivering therapy? If that's the case, then the new rules are likely to apply to your product. So one of the rules is for products that provide information for diagnosis or screening. So this rule is multifaceted. It has ranges from the highest classification, class 3 to class 1, depending on the information the product provides and who it provides it to. So it distinguishes between information provided to lay people, or where software makes a decision itself, versus when that information is provided to a clinician for the purposes of them making a diagnosis, in which case there's a slightly lower classification allowed. So the other things that impact the classification are the seriousness of the disease or condition that is being diagnosed or screened for. So the highest classification will apply where there's a condition that may lead to death or a severe deterioration in a person's health, and then it gets bumped down as the seriousness of the condition is not as serious. So there's another classification rule specifically for monitoring the state or progression of a disease or condition, or parameters to do with a patient that allows the progression of the disease to be monitored by proxy. So the classification for this rule again can range from class 1 to 2B, and it's all dependent on the information that's being provided and the amount of danger it indicates about the patient. So if it indicates whether the patient being monitored is in immediate danger, it would be class 2B. 2A if it indicates danger that's not immediate, and class 1 if there is no danger being indicated. So think about the difference between an emergency alert where a health professional needs to intervene in a matter of minutes, versus something, well, this could have an implication on someone's health, but it doesn't need to be actioned urgently, versus something that's kind of for information that people need to be aware of, but it doesn't necessarily indicate whether the patient's in danger or not. There's another new rule regarding software or a program device that specifies or recommends a treatment or intervention. So the device doesn't have to be performing the treatment or intervention itself, it's just providing information about what the treatment or intervention should be. And like the diagnosis rule, this distinguishes between who the information is being provided to and who is the decision maker. Is it a lay person or the software itself, versus is it a recommendation for a clinician to actually make a decision? So again, this the classification depends again on how risky the treatment or intervention or its absence is. So if the treatment itself or if it's withheld can lead to death or a severe debilitation to that patient, it'll be the highest classification, versus a treatment that's unlikely to cause harm, in which case it'll be a lower classification. We also have introduced a rule for software that provides therapy through the provision of information. So the idea here is the information constitutes the therapy. This rule was introduced largely to capture certain forms of cognitive behavioral therapy and things like that, which are intended to be delivered outside of the supervision of a health professional. And we do have an exclusion in place for certain mental health tools, but the idea was this rule would cover those systems that are not excluded. So the classification again depends on the risk of harm to the person, if they carry out that therapy incorrectly, or if there's anything wrong with the nature of that therapy. If it can result in harm to the patient, it gets a higher classification, whereas if there's no or little risk of harm, then it gets a lower classification. So the other thing we did, Xin-Lin introduced the essential principles. We made some changes to EP 12.1, which is specifically requirements for software and program devices. So it's not a new requirement, we just made it we expanded it to make it a bit more explicit in terms of the expectations we have around cybersecurity, the management of data and privacy, platform requirements and compatibility for operating environments and things like that, and also requirements relating to development, production, and maintenance. There are also some practical changes to EP 13, which is about information provided with devices. We amended this to allow information to be provided electronically for software and program devices, whereas you weren't able to do that previously. And we also introduced a requirement that current version and build numbers for software must be made accessible to users of software-based devices. So we have published some guidance on cybersecurity, and we've updated this recently to cover those changes to the essential principles, and that's available on our website, and there's a link included on this slide. And this is the slide I tacked in because we get a lot of questions about the use of AI in medical devices. And I won't go into it in a lot of detail today, but the two questions we largely get relate to what happens when a product uses AI. Does it affect whether it's a medical device or the risk of that device? And the short answer is no. It doesn't matter what technology your product uses, whether it's AI or something else. It depends on what that device is intended to do. So if it's intended to be for diagnosis, monitoring, etc., then yes, it'll be a medical device. The use of AI also doesn't affect the risk classification of the device. Again, it's what is that AI? What is that device being used for? So if it's diagnosing a very serious condition and providing that diagnostic information directly to a layperson, so think an app that can screen for a serious form of cancer or something like that, then that would, if whether it was using AI or not, would still have the highest risk classification. Where AI does become important is if you do have a medical device that uses AI, you will need to consider how can you effectively show that you have validated your product and that it's fit for purpose. So just like any other product, if there are any appropriate standards and things like that that you can apply, you can do so, but they have to be appropriate for the use. I've also included a slide here for advertising medical devices because a lot of software medical devices these days are in the form of apps that are provided directly to consumers. So there are different requirements for advertising to consumers and health professionals. You can say a lot more in advertising to health professionals. However, you have to show that it's only available to them. If you have a general website or something that anyone can access, then that would be considered consumer advertising as well. So what you can't say in consumer ads, just this is the kind of more common offenders, I suppose, is you can't include any endorsements or testimonials or anything like that from health professionals or medical researchers or those sorts of individuals. And you can't use phrases that imply regulatory approval. So you can't use the phrase TGA approved or FDA approved, even if that may be factual. So if you do have a TGA, a product on the ARTG, you're allowed to say that as a statement of fact that the device is included on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, but you can't say the phrase TGA approved. The last two dot points are kind of no-brainers. You can't make unsubstantiated claims about your software, and you can't make claims that are beyond the approved intended purpose of your software. So think back to that little thermometer example. If your product is approved for a particular purpose, you can't make claims that go beyond that unless your product has been approved for that. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. So I guess we can open it up for questions.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I do have a couple of questions here. And I just encourage you to send them in. We've got 7 minutes left. We will have to do a hard cutoff at 1 o'clock because unfortunately the presenters have to go to another very important TGA meeting. But the first question is from Andre, who asked about the question regarding that rule you mentioned relating to apps that are providing healthcare like cognitive behavioral therapy. He asks, where is that? So just let me come back to this. Where is this rule specified in the Act?
So all the classification rules are listed in full in the Therapeutic Goods Medical Devices Regulations. So it's a subordinate piece of legislation, and they're all in, I'm going to get this wrong, I believe Schedule 2 is the classification rules.
Yes, you're right, that's Schedule 2.
And we are on the very cusp of actually publishing a detailed guidance document on the classification rules for active medical devices, including software, which is probably a bit more accessible, hopefully, than going directly to the legislation. So I'm happy to share that once it's available.
Excitement, you heard it first here on the New South Wales Active MedTech community. Thank you. So can you tell us more about that? What is this for active medical devices? What is it?
It's so all the classification rules are listed in the regulations, and if you're interested to go look it up, it is so it's Schedule 2, and it's Rule 4.8 is the rule that's specific for information as therapy. So we're just developing a guidance document which is adjunct to the legislation. So for people who specifically are developing active medical devices, that will highlight the classification rules that are likely to apply to your products.
Right. So when you do launch that, we'd love you to come back and present to us again and maybe just walk us through it. That'd be great. So Pierre asks, the testimonial rule, does it apply to physical products too?
Yes. So if you're talking about the advertising code, that's for all medical devices. Sure. So even if it's some kind of physical product, you still can't make claims that it's endorsed by a health professional or anything like that. It's kind of where that dentist joke on ads came from. It's sort of that basis.
Yeah. Jeff Size asks, if a device is developed and or manufactured in Australia exclusively for export, what TGA rules apply to it?
Did you want to cover that one, Xin-Lin, or I can if you like?
Sure. The same rules would apply, only that all export only devices are regulated as Class 1 devices. So in terms of the regulatory scrutiny or oversight, it's essentially the same as for any other Class 1 product. It's a self-declaration of conformity. Olivia, feel free to jump in if there's anything further you want to add to that.
No, that covers it. I think because the idea there is that whichever jurisdiction that you're supplying it into, you would have to meet whatever regulatory requirements they have as well.
Yeah. Andre asks, where can we find the guidance references on marketing claims for devices in the regulations?
We are currently, again, we're doing a lot of work on guidance at the moment. So I'm working on some kind of explainers, more fact sheet explainers specifically for software and active devices, but there is a whole hub on our website dedicated to how you can advertise therapeutic goods. So I'm happy to send through the links to the information that we have published.
Sure. Now, actually, did you have any slides at the end here about the contact details? Did they drop off yours?
They might have dropped off mine.
Could we just swap back to Xin-Lin's slide, which had your contact details there? I'm not sure if you put them in at the end. Because you can provide them to me, and if you like. Now, would have been the second last slide, I guess. Now, just while we're waiting, I had a question of my own here. When sponsors are developing medical devices and they approach the TGA, their commercial interest is they want it to be as fast as possible, go through it the first pass. Can you tell us, do you have any advice on what are the most common errors you see from people? Just, tips and tricks to smooth the process and make it go as quickly as it can. Any thoughts on that?
Xin-Lin, did you want to?
Yes, sorry, to clarify, you are asking if someone has developed a new product and tips and tricks for getting that onto the Australian market?
Yes. So they developed a product here in Australia. They're approaching you to get approval.
Sure.
And let's assume for the moment that they haven't gone via 510K or Europe. They're getting it approved via the TGA directly. You must surely see a whole lot of clunkers where you just go, oh, they're missing this, or they're, what's the short list of most common errors people make that really slow down that approval process?
Sure. For devices with a higher classification, so a class 3 device, for instance, I think usually the challenge there would be obtaining, having sufficient clinical studies and having sufficient data to demonstrate the efficacy and safety of the product. And that's probably the biggest challenge there, and making sure that the clinical evidence that's obtained is robust. So, ideally not a single center, single surgeon study, but ideally, a multi-center and done across various populations as well, that is more robust. And that I think would be the key usually when it comes to clinical evidence. And also when there is comparisons made against a predicate device, so a device that's already in the market, or they may be making comparisons against a similar device that is known to have no major adverse events or issues, for instance. What are those devices really similar? Because sometimes there is that there are questions that or issues that arises there in terms of the actual similarity and the ability for making equivalence claims for the device in question.
Great. And is that something you can clarify in your pre-submission meetings?
Yes, certainly. Definitely, and I think that's where the pre-submission meetings come in really useful. And so we do have pre-submission meetings in the conformity assessment space. So that's the space where if they're trying to obtain certification for their device, for the manufacturer, sorry, and also in the inclusion space. And so that's with my area in terms of demonstrating that they have sufficient data and just checking in on whether they have the information that would be necessary for an application.
Sure. Now, I'll ask you a few hard questions now. Quite often, like the product developers really rely on regulatory consultants to give them advice on this. How often do you find that the advice that's given by regulatory consultants really conflicts with the actual judgments that you make? And how much should product developers rely on the regulatory consultants out there rather than perhaps coming to you directly?
I would say it's really often it's useful having regulatory affairs consultants assisting sponsors and manufacturers in that space. I don't really have any. I don't really see any hindrances in that. I mean, Olivia, do you?
No, I think generally it's a very positive interaction that, and I mean, that's their role is for that exact purpose, to provide that really clear regulatory guidance and that sort of thing. That's very specific to their data and their applications and things like that, which we aren't really able to do outside of an application. As Xin-Lin said, we can't actually assess data and things like that until we get it as part of an application. So a lot of those consultants, they'll be specialists in particular kinds of devices as well, which is really useful. And we tend to have a really good relationship with them in terms of information sharing, and they will come to us if they don't know as well. So yeah, it's definitely a good thing to do. Sorry, go on.
So sorry. I was just going to say, and we do usually encourage applicants who aren't familiar with regulations to seek the assistance of a regulatory consultant.
Sure. Okay, and the last question I have really is around the pathway to market. There seems to be a common perception in the industry that it's easier to go via Europe or the US to get your initial regulatory approval and then come to the TGA. What's your comment on that?
We get asked that a lot, and it's not about whether it's easier. It's just that if you intend to supply your device overseas, because we accept regulatory approvals from overseas from a lot of major jurisdictions, you may as well just go through them so you don't have to duplicate it, because there aren't many other jurisdictions that do the same. So for example, if you wanted to supply in the US, they won't accept an Australian certification. So that's really the reason why we tell people that that's an important thing to consider.
Excellent. And in terms of the time frame, if somebody did come to the TGA only with a device, how long would you expect should they be, I guess, budgeting in their project timelines? How long would a typical approval for, let's say, a class 2B medical active medical device, how long would it take to get through the entire approval process and onto the ARTG?
I can comment, if you're talking about going through conformity assessment and the whole certification process, that can be quite a long time. There's not really a definitive time frame I can put on it, because a lot of it depends on the preparedness of that company to go through that assessment process. So how, as Xin-Lin said before, if their clinical data is put in place, how successfully they've implemented a quality management system. So if the manufacturer's done everything they need to, it can take anywhere between 6 months and a year, or possibly longer if the data isn't quite there. In terms of including the product on the ARTG, Xin-Lin can tell you more about the timeframes related to that.
Yes, so if it is, if the conformity assessment is undertaken by the TGA, then it's a really quick process in terms of getting it included in the ARTG. If an overseas certification is relied upon, then it really depends on whether that application is selected for an audit based on the assessment by the delegate. So if it isn't selected for audit, it gets on within 20 business days. As mentioned earlier, it's a preliminary assessment, and if a decision is made not to select it for audit, it gets on the register. If it's selected for audit, it then depends on whether it's a level 1 or 2, and then again, it depends on what is deficient with the application and the gaps that needs to be addressed.
Sure. Are you able to take a few more minutes? I notice it's 1:06 already. That's stretching the friendship?
We could probably do 4 more minutes and be 10 minutes late for our meeting.
Okay, so just another question on the timeline is, if you've got, for example, a class 2D device with 510K approval, and you come to the TGA, again, what is the time frame, typical time frame to get through the approval process?
Again, same as before, it really depends on what that product is and whether there's any general concerns. So that we do work very closely with our post-market colleagues as well. So for instance, there might be certain products out in the market that are known to have certain adverse events, for instance, and those are the products that will likely pick up for an audit, for instance, just to be certain that you know, there's no safety concerns and that the efficacy data is there, for example. If the delegate has no concerns with that particular application, it will get through within 20 business days.
Okay, thanks. Now, can you just, one last question from Jeff Sizer. We were talking a lot about software and the Headline Act standard for around software for active medical devices in the hardware side of things, rather than the necessarily the, well, it's for both, but is IEC 62304. Have you got any comments on just how well Australian software developers are complying with that standard, or any comments about how far you go into looking into conformance with that standard?
Look, I can start by saying this is a good starting off point. It's a good standard to kind of start as a basis for showing compliance with the essential principles for software. It is not mandatory, however, so we do consider it state of the art, and if people aren't complying with it, we'd expect the equivalent or a good justification of why not. That also applies to particular parts of the standard. Someone might choose to apply certain parts but not others because they are less applicable for whatever reason. In terms of how well Australian software developers are complying with it, it's just like any other standard. I mean, some companies that are a bit more experienced with it do it quite well, others not so much. It is one of those standards that's very high level and principles based anyway, so it doesn't really tell you exactly how to do any of those things. It kind of tells you what sort of documents you should have in place, what kinds of procedures you should have in place. So at a high level, I think it's fairly well understood, but just how people then implement it and actually apply it to their products just varies.